This is the Montane zone, and it's the bottom of the Montane zone. It starts at around 8,000 feet, goes up to about 10,000 feet. But the lower edges of the Montane zone are still a little drier, and they're hilly. Hillsides face either south or north. The north-facing slopes often have different vegetation than the south-facing slopes. So at this elevation, at the lower part of the Montane zone, we have forests and we have meadows. In the forests, on north-facing slopes, we'll have subalpine fir and sometimes Douglas fir at the lower elevations. And in the south-facing slopes, they're either bare and grassy, or there'll be Douglas fir there, which is more drought tolerant and actually prefers a drier soil in the late summer. So Douglas fir is the one that's more common right here where we're at today. We're in Atlantic City on South Pass, and we're at almost 8,000 feet. And there's a lot of Douglas fir on the north-facing slopes. This is Douglas fir, and these are the branches that would be used medicinally. I'll show you what the tree looks like so you can see that when they're producing cones, they have a very distinctive cone. And it has been described as a cone that hangs down with little mice crawling up under the scales. Because if you look closely at these bracts sticking out from the scales, it looks like two legs and a tail of a mouse. So that's how you can identify Douglas fir cones. They're very distinctive cones that don't look like the other ones. And Douglas fir is called a fir because it's got a single needle that's flat, so it looks like a fir. Botanically, it's not a true fir. And so it's called pseudotsuga, which means a false fir. And but for all practical purposes, we treat it like a true fir because chemically it's just the same as the true firs. The true fir would be subalpine fir, which grows in this area. And that's actually what this one is. This is subalpine fir. And it's also one needle. The needles are usually a little longer than on Douglas fir, but not always. Depends on the habitat. But the cones on subalpine fir are very different from these that hang down. Subalpine fir cones grow straight up, and they're pointed up. And they're usually at the tops of the tree, whereas Douglas fir cones go all the way down to the ground level. So there's some differences, but they're used the same way. Subalpine fir was preferred as a wintertime tea to drink around the fire when people are telling stories, not only because it has a nice, tangy, sweet flavor, but it was also used as a treatment, as a prevention from sickness. So when contagious diseases start to show up, this was thought to resist infection from things like smallpox and the common cold and other diseases that came in with the white man. I prefer this. I prefer tea made out of subalpine fir. But Douglas fir tea is very similar, not quite as tangy, but it's a good tea to drink. I'd say in the 45 years I worked in the mountains, I drank subalpine fir tea probably at least twice a week, just because it tastes good. I really enjoy it. So when people are sitting around the fire in the wintertime telling stories, because the wintertime was the time when people sat around teepee and told stories, many times they were probably drinking subalpine fir tea in the Shoshone tradition. Depending on where their winter camp was, they might have been using Douglas fir tea. maybe not every night, but at least a couple of times a week. So we can make some tea out of this subalpine fir. I'll show you how to do it. I can right now put these juniper berries back and show you the first part of the process of making the tea. So we've got a branch and a mono and a metate. And here's the process. I'm going to make some room here. While it's still on a whole branch, we'll break this up into pieces later. But right now it's kind of handy to keep it this way. And then very lightly tap the needles until they show signs of oozing water out of the little branch needles. Now you can start to see it. See little glistening droplets of moisture coming out of the needles, and that's what you want. If you take that now and sniff it, it's wonderful. It's a spicy pine resin type of odor that is very pleasant, and that's what it will taste like when you make tea out of it. So we just go through the whole thing and then finish it off with a little twist. And then we'll go do that all the way along these different branches. And we'll just make a small quantity because all we have here is me and Kyle Duba, who is the videographer, the cameraman. We don't need a large quantity. For just a couple of us, that's probably enough. And here we have enough for 2 people and a pot of tea. And what we will do is take these now that they're mashed. They're smelling really good. It's kind of like a Christmas tree. So sometimes I call this Christmas tea. These will go into a pot of boiling water. You turn off the heat so it's just simmering, and in 20 minutes these floating branches sink to the bottom. That happens to be when the tea is at its peak of flavor and it turns a little green and has its best flavor. At that point, you take these out of the water. If you leave them in, it gets bitter. But we'll do that. So now that we've pounded these branches and needles to break down the fibers and the cell walls, we can throw them into the water and they'll release their flavor into the tea. When we do that, we want to turn down the heat so it just simmers. And we'll let that simmer for about 20 minutes till the branches sink. The subalpine fir tea is done, and it has sunk to the bottom of the pot. That is your clue that it's ready and it's at its peak of flavor. If you let it sit there for another hour, it's going to get bitter tasting. So if you're going to keep the tea around, you need to spoon out those branches and needles and just leave the tea. So we can pour it off now. And you see it's not very dark colored, but it's very flavorful. A little bit of spice, kind of a sweetness to it, and a delicious woodsy flavor. It's kind of like, well, it's kind of like being out in the woods when you smell the fir trees, but it's the taste of it that's really delicious. Not resiny. It doesn't have that sap flavor that you would get with pine needles. And a lot of times the Indians will refer to pine needle tea, and sometimes they mean pine needles, but often they meant fir needles, because in translations, all of the conifers were referred to as pines. So this is a delicious tea that's high in antioxidants. The proanthocyanidin antioxidants that are used for sore throats and to keep you from getting a cold. So this was an all winter time drink that was served in the teepees. And I can drink it all day long. It's delicious. So this is a typical Montane meadow. And inside the forest, on the edge of the meadow, usually on hillsides that have a little bit of an opening, we can find raspberry plants. They like south-facing slopes. They like a little sunlight on the edge of a forest. And raspberry had two functions. The berries are highly savored in the summertime when they were ripe in July. But they didn't preserve raspberries very often. They don't preserve well. So it was one of those trail foods that was eaten while you were out there. They might gather a large quantity of it to eat in camp that night. But otherwise, it was something you ate while you found the plants. I don't know of this berry being saved for winter use. But the leaves of raspberry had a very specific use and very commonly collected and saved for winter by the whole village for women that were pregnant, because the leaves were drunk as a tea only after they're dry. The fresh leaves were never used, but the dried leaves were used to ease childbirth. There were probably other things that were used to ease childbirth, as to take away some of the pain. But we don't know what all of them are. Maybe some people know, but I haven't heard about it. What's in the literature is these leaves were used, and they were just made into a tea that you drank sometime close to the time of giving birth. There were many stories of Indian women giving birth to children without any pain, and those have been pretty much discredited as wild stories that can't be substantiated, except I believe it. And if you read the biography of Pretty Shield, she speaks to the author of this book who was interviewing her, Frank Linderman, about her whole life in this book. And she grew up before the reservations started, so they were still on their migratory nomadic culture. This is the river crow culture, and didn't know about reservations yet when she had her first child. So they were eating their natural diet, the traditional cultural diet, and being raised by the grandmother, which was also traditional. The younger people, the parents, were out gathering food, and the kids were raised by the grandparents. She describes having her first child as being out in front of the teepee playing with a friend of hers at 14 years old, and then grabbing her belly because of some feeling inside, and her grandmother was watching and came over and put her hand on her shoulder and said, "It's time to go into the teepee now." And she rolled up a buffalo hide, put 2 sticks in the ground for Pretty Shield to hold on to, and she kneeled down on the buffalo hide and squirted out a kid, and then went back to playing after she was cleaned up. And she describes this as a painless childbirth that was common in the days before the reservations. We don't know what other teas her grandmother gave her to drink, but we know that raspberry leaf was the common one that survived through the years and made it to the modern times. So she said after the Indian women moved on the reservation and started eating white man's food, they had just as much pain in childbirth as the white women did. And that's interesting. So I had to try that, and I worked for a clinic in Colorado. We were testing out Native American medicines on patients in Boulder, Colorado, who wanted to try this, wanted to be part of these tests. And we got some women who had never had a child before and some that had had children before, and had them try raspberry leaf tea. And the reports we got were very positive that it actually did ease childbirth and took away a good deal of the pain. So, needs to be studied some more, but I believe it's a tea that is good for easing childbirth. So, wild strawberries are also common as an understory plant in the montane forest. So there are places where wild strawberries make up the ground cover under a forest canopy. And these berries are very good to eat, of course, but the birds get most of them. And sometimes other animals will come by and eat the berries. So you got to be quick to get the berries. The strawberry leaves were also made into a tea, and they were supposed to promote contentment. This was kind of a psychological treatment for people who were depressed. And you could be depressed because you're grieving over the loss of a loved one, or many other reasons. This is the treatment, the tea of the strawberry leaves. Strawberries and the leaves have an anti-cancer drug in them called ellagic acid, and the leaves were used for skin cancers by rubbing on and poulticing on skin cancer growth. This is cow parsnip, common mountain plant growing in wet soils and along streams. It had a couple of different uses. It's a favorite food of bears and moose, which is an interesting aside. You never hear about moose being hunted as food in the Shoshone tradition before the reservations. There's a good reason for that. There weren't any moose in Wyoming until about the turn of the century, well after the time the Shoshones went on the reservation. They had come down from Canada in a wave after the fur trade and made it to Wyoming around the 1890s, late 1890s. But anyway, cow parsnip is a medicinal plant. The Blackfeet call it big medicine. And one of the things it does, especially the seeds of this plant, the seeds made into a tea can be used to reverse paralysis. If somebody has an injury where they're paralyzed and can't move an arm, or they're paralyzed from the waist down, or more commonly the paralysis that affects the face, that from the fifth cranial nerve that comes across the face and controls facial muscles, Bell's palsy, is treatable with this, and the tincture of this is a standard treatment now for that kind of paralysis, which is nerve damage. So this is a nerve medicine. It stimulates nerve growth, and it's used as a tincture or a tea or a poultice, depending on the injury. I have used it on some fairly serious paralysis. One fellow here in town who was in a car accident and is paralyzed from the waist down for 2 years before we tried this on him, and within a week of drinking the tea, he started feeling tingling in his toes for the first time, and then in 2 weeks he was moving his toes, and 6 months later he could lift his leg up on the left side, and then after that his right leg. And I watched him drive a motorcycle a year later, so he was improving. The problem with it is it stimulates nerve growth. So with cases of paralysis, the motor nerves get stimulated first, and you can regain mobility, at least some of it. But then it stimulates the sensory nerves, and that's when the pain starts. So it's not a foolproof medicine. It has its problems. It can intensify pain sometimes by stimulating nerve growth. So it has to be regulated. I think the medicine men and medicine women who use these plants knew what to do about that. We're still experimenting with it in modern medicine, but it does work to treat nerve damage, severed nerves, and damage due to injury on nerves. The leaves, when they're very young, can be eaten, but when they get older, they affect some people by making them photosensitive, so they have trouble being out in sunlight. So it's a good idea to start slow if you're going to eat this plant, and get familiar with how you react to it before you eat a large quantity of it. It's got kind of a strong celery type flavor. The stalk of the plant, as it matures before it flowers and then after flowers, those stems, those flower stalks are hollow inside, and they have a lot of water in the stem. So these stems were cut, and when you cut the stem into a little stick, the fibers start to extrude. You could sit there and watch it, and these little vascular tubes start to poke out the cut edge, and they become a brush. So these were used as rubbing sticks. All over the world there are rubbing sticks that you use as a toothbrush. And you kind of rub them around your teeth, makes your mouth feel fresh, kills bacteria because it's a bactericide in the fluid, and your mouth turns green, your saliva turns green from the chlorophyll that's loosely bound in this cell fiber. And those are the characteristics of rubbing sticks. Sometimes in Africa they use palm petioles, the base of a palm leaf. Same characteristics, loosely bound chlorophyll, so your saliva turns green and it fights bacteria. And little fibers poke out and make a brush when you cut it. So this is one of the rubbing sticks. There's a native thistle that was also used that way as a rubbing stick to keep teeth clean. So we think the toothbrush was invented in the 1800s, but it's actually thousands of years old. These are some of the seeds of the cow parsnip. And those seeds in those pods that are ground up, these seeds are ground in amano and metate, and at least crushed to put into hot water and make this medicinal tea for paralysis and nerve damage. But the roots are also used. Some years these plants don't produce seeds and the roots can be used. But we're going to skip this one because it's not important and move on to desert parsley. Desert parsley is one of the primary medicinal plants of the Shoshones, the Crows, the Blackfeet, Paiutes, and Pueblos. It was used to protect you from getting sick and to actually treat an illness, and it's renowned for treating things that we know now are viral infections, but they treat both bacterial and viral infections that are topical or internal. So this is used to treat pneumonia, and it's the root that's used. Desert parsley is what we call it, Lomatium dissectum. Lomatium is the general name for the biscuit roots, so this is in that group of biscuit roots. But desert parsley is a very strong smelling plant, so it's often not used as food, although it is edible, it could be used as food. Sorry. So the root could be used as food, but what is used as food is those very finely dissected leaves, which is where the Latin name dissectum comes from. Is the leaves are finely dissected, and just like parsley, that's why the name desert parsley applies. And those are very tasty green to throw into cooking. So you boil them for a little bit and they add a nice flavor to stews with meat in them. The seeds are also a spice that was thrown into cooking, adds a carrot spicy flavor to it. Remember, most of the spices we have in the grocery store are in the carrot family. We have spices like caraway and anise and carrot seed, many others, cilantro, coriander. They're all in the same parsley family or carrot family. So in addition, in cow parsnip, in addition to taking care of problems with severed nerves and damaged nerves from injuries, there are other nerve problems you could use cow parsnip for. Heracleum lanatum is what it says on the jar here, Gila, and that's the Latin name. Heracleum lanatum for cow parsnip. These are the cow parsnip seeds in alcohol, and this tincture can be rubbed on other kinds of nerve problems. For instance, neuropathy in the feet, which is common when people get to be around my age. You start to lose the feeling in your feet, and it kind of feels like your socks are bunched up and you lose your balance because you're not really making good contact with the ground anymore. This is a treatment for that. You just rub it on the bottoms of the feet, and it restores feeling to the soles of your feet, so it actually can improve your balance and prevent injury. It's just another use. It's another nerve stimulating use for cow parsnip. So I've talked to several Shoshone tribal members in western and eastern Shoshone who still use desert parsley in the old way, and it's called bear medicine. And that's one of the names for the medicinal qualities of this plant. It's bear medicine. In the Shoshone language, it's called doza or dotsa. I've heard it pronounced two different ways, but doza, I think, is the Shoshone word for this plant. And it's supposed to prevent sickness. So the traditional way to use it is to wear it on a necklace and just keep it here when you're exposed to somebody who may be sick and you don't want to catch it. There was one epidemiological study done on the Western Shoshones in 1918 during the Spanish flu, where it was reported that people were hanging this plant in their house and wearing the roots around their neck, which is traditional when you think you might be exposed to an illness. And there were no illnesses from the Spanish flu, according to what I read of that study in 1918, which was killing like 20% of the population of the United States at that time. So that's kind of an appropriate topic, considering we're doing a video presentation here because of the coronavirus that's going around right now. And this would be a traditional thing that Shoshone people could use as a way to prevent infection. It has a noticeable odor that's not offensive. It's just very unique to this root. And the way I understand it, when you think you're very close to somebody who's sick, you could just chew on a little bit of this. Chew it completely up and swallow it. And it's supposed to be a viral killing medicine. What exactly does that as a component isn't known yet, but what I can tell you is when the AIDS epidemic became very serious in the United States in around 1981, many pharmaceutical companies were given the job of looking for a medicine that would kill the AIDS virus. They knew it was a virus, but at that time they didn't know it was a retrovirus, which can't be killed. It attaches itself to the RNA in your own body's genetic code. So it can't be killed without killing the host organism. But before they knew that, labs were studying everything they could to try to find a new medicine. The ordinary antiviral medicines were not working. So what I know, because I called one of those labs to find out what they were researching, and they were researching this. This is Lomatium dissectum, or desert parsley, and they were researching another plant called Osha, which is another Native American medicinal antiviral plant that's a close relative of this. So the pharmaceutical companies are well aware of these medicines and how they work. It's just that if they can't synthesize it, they can't patent it, and they can't sell it. So it's already been clinically studied and known to be an antiviral medicine. You can buy desert parsley usually under the name Lomatium, but you need to turn it around and read the bottle for the fine print, because there's a Chinese Lomatium also, which is closely related but a different plant. But most of the Lomatiums that come in a tincture form now are available in health food stores, good ones, and in herb stores. And they're specifically designed to keep you healthy during the flu season, or when you think you might be susceptible to some kind of contagious pathogen. And I will continue to wear this necklace when I think there's a contagious virus going around. I think it actually works. The Shoshones call this bear medicine. The Crows call it lightning root. And the story there, we were told, is that the energy in this root that is so medicinal is the energy of lightning when it hits the ground, and it spreads out underground. And if this root is growing there, that's the energy it picks up, and why it's such a strong medicine. As this root grows, it gets bigger. This is the same root as this one, lightning root. And if you let it grow for 10 years or so, it will get 4 or 5 times this bulbous. And then it becomes less medicinal, but picks up a very strong odor that's not pleasant. And the Crows call it stinky root. So they have 2 different names for this root depending on how old it is. It's very medicinal, and in this stage used as lightning root. And when it gets a little bigger than this, here's a bigger one, It'll get some side roots off of it, and little rhizomes, and then it's called stinky root by the crows. So the other close relative of this in Shoshone is called bear root. This is called bear medicine. But this plant here has white flowers on an umbel, whereas the desert parsley looks very similar but has yellow flowers on an umbel. So desert parsley has yellow flowers. Osha root has white flowers and a much more odoriferous root. And you can smell quite a ways off if somebody's chewing on it. And that is the most common root used by, traditionally by native people from Mexico all the way to Alaska, is Osha root, a close relative of this bear medicine. And it's called bear root in English, but in the indigenous trade network that was from Mexico to Alaska, if something had a high value, then one name would stick, and all the tribes used the same name no matter what their language was. So Osha was one of those. Osha is a root that was traded so heavily because of its medicinal ability to protect you from infections and to use on infections and to use in the sweat lodge, that it retained the one name, Osha. This is an Osha root, it goes this way. The stems come off here, and it's got all of these very bristly, stiff hairs that are on the upper part of the root where it comes up out of the ground. So this is the stem of the flower stalk right here. You can see all these bristly hairs coming up along that stem. That's a characteristic of Osha root. Another characteristic is a very, very characteristic classic smell. When the root dries, it's a kind of a pleasant smell. It's relaxing, and that's one of the traits of this root is it relaxes people and it makes them congenial. That's why they smudge this in the sweat lodge, so that everybody feels like they're part of one group. And it's used in ceremonies for that purpose, to make everybody feel like they're part of a family. There's a good chemical reason for that. And this is an oddity because usually plants don't produce human hormones. But in this case, Osha root produces a hormone that humans also produce at a certain time. And it's the hormone that women produce when they give birth, so they'll bond with their baby. It's called oxytocin. So when you smudge this plant, you can do it in your house, and it's a pleasant smell that is in the smoke, and it gets into your bloodstream, and it causes you to be more accepting of other people. And it's a relaxant also. And it's a pleasant smell. There are other chemicals in Osha root that kill viruses and kill bacteria. So you can pound this root and get a powder out of it, save it, and sprinkle it into wounds to prevent infections. You can make a tincture out of it. You can use glycerin or alcohol, or just put it in water, warm water, and let it soak overnight and drink that to keep from getting the flu, to keep from getting contagious infections that are going around in the air. And Osha is famous for that. Of all of the medicines, this is probably the best known in the indigenous network of medicines, and it's highly prized and being over harvested in some areas because of that. Not by native people, but by people who found out that it really does work now in modern times. They're digging up huge quantities of this, and it's endangered in some areas because you can sell it. So Osha is pronounced with an accent on the A, O-S-H-A with an accent, so it's Osha. Probably derives from one of the native languages as the word for bear. So it's called bear root in the Shoshone tradition, and the Crows call it essay. So the tops of Osha root are also edible and a pot herb. So although that's a very strong tasting root, the leaves of Osha are abundant and they're parsley-like and they taste very good. When the plants are young, before they flower, the leaves are kind of like parsley and mild, but as it blooms, the leaves become a little more bitter and you have to boil them to eat them. But it's definitely a mountain plant that grows between 8 and 10,000 feet most happily. This is one of the 5 species we have. There are 3 that grow in Wyoming, 3 species, but they're all treated the same way. The leaves look a little different, and there's a slight difference in the flower structure if you're looking at it with a microscope. But basically, they have the same kind of root and the same smell and the same potency as a medicinal plant. And that's a little piece of the root. The way these roots are prepared is, since they have so much hair and fiber and stiff bristles on them, is they're basically cleaned off with water, scraped with some scraping rock or a knife to get the dirt off, and then thrown into a cool fire, that is, into a fire pit where the fire is died down to just some embers that are not real hot. And then the roots are stirred in there to burn off the hairs, and that's what cleans the root. And then you take it out and rub it with something, a knife blade or a piece of cardboard, anything to just get the burned hair fibers off of the outside of it. And then it'll preserve in a container for years. After about 3 years, it's no longer effective. But before 3 years, it's good for contagious illnesses, and also it's been used for Lyme disease successfully in many people. So as we get up into the upper Montane zone, we have a wetter climate. The higher you go in the mountains, the more moisture there is for that mountain range. So the Wind River Range is what we're in here, which is, part of the Wind River Reservation. And actually some of the prettiest parts of the Wind River Range are on the reservation. That's where the rivers begin, and we have a lot of plants that are adapted to shorter growing season, more cold climate, and more moisture in the soil. So this is the North Fork of the Paposia River where it starts. And of course there's fish, which was a food source. And we have willows, which is the main food of moose, especially in the wintertime. This is a female moose. Of course, the males lose their antlers, so the way you tell a female moose is they have that little white patch at the base of the tail. when you're classifying these animals. It's usually in the winter when they're all together. So that's the only way you can tell a male from a female if they're young moose, usually is that little white patch on the tail. But they eat a lot of willows, which is a plant that's high in salicin, which was theoretically produced by the plant because it's bitter tasting and it prevents most other animals from eating it. But moose have adapted to eating that taste. It's bitter. But salicin is mainly what is used in willows. And there's a fresh willow being eaten by a goat, because goats and moose both can deal with salicylic acid and not be harmed by it. I have a willow stick here to show you how it was used. Shoshones used yellow willow, which is this, for medicine. And it was used as a pain reliever for systemic pain like headaches and body aches, toothaches. And I'm missing my knife. Oh, here it is. Part that's used on willows is the inner bark. And that's the green part underneath the outer bark, like right here. And usually you use a fairly young branch as opposed to the bigger, thicker branches, because there's more salicin in the younger growth. And if you see, the outer bark is brown and it peels off. Underneath is a succulent green layer, which is the inner bark. That's where all the salicin is. That's the part you can take off and dry and save it in a pouch. It'll dry out to like paper consistency, and then you rehydrate it in water when you make tea out of it. And you have an analgesic. You have something that will treat a headache or fever or hangover or the blahs sometimes when you're just not feeling good on a rainy day. It's good for sore throat medicine. In that case, it's usually mixed with cherry bark, chokecherry. Chokecherry inner bark has a cyanide sugar in it that's soothing to the throat and kills bacteria. This takes care of the pain as an analgesic, and the combination of the two is a common tea that was used medicinally for the common cold and a sore throat. But willow bark also has other uses because yellow willow is very strong. You can pull it and it doesn't break. So for that reason, you can use it as a cordage material. You can make bandages out of it. I call this a wilderness bandage. You wrap it around an injury. Well, first you chew on it, like that. The part you've chewed on, you've broken up the inner bark fibers and exposed the salicylic acid to the air. And that part is what you wrap directly onto a wound that you want pain relief from. And you can tie on things like arnica if it's not an open wound, or things like goldenrod pollen, that's an antibacterial and antifungal agent, and tie it right on as a bandage. Because you can tie a knot in willow bark. And then when you do that, it dries hard. It's kind of hard to do one-handed here, but try it. I'm not succeeding very well. better if you do it for somebody else. Well, you might have to take my word for it. But you get the idea. It's a, it's a way to tie things together. And since you can tie it in a knot if you're less fumble-fingered than I am. Maybe we got it here. Almost had it. Kind of a bitter flavor, but when you know it works, it's actually not bad. Oh, here. So that'll stay on there all day long. It'll actually last for several days. And as it dries, it will harden and shrink. So it makes a really good bandage. If you want to cover this whole thing with something, you could use that sonopi, which is the pine pitch from lodgepole pine or pinyon pine, and just cover the whole thing with that, and that'll solidify and form a waterproof and airtight covering over it, which falls off naturally in about 2 days. So there's different ways that you could bandage your poultice using willow and pine pitch. And again, we have examples of using the willow bark, as in this broom, to tie fibers together to make tools. So when this dries, and this one is dry now, it's very rigid and solid and will last for years because it shrinks onto the thing you're tying it around. So this is the ponderosa pine broom with willow bark tie on it. So willows are also used in Western Shoshone tradition for making baskets. And in that case, rather than gathering them in the spring, which is when you do it, like right now when these buds are just swelling up, is when you gather yellow willow to use as a medicinal tea. But to make baskets, you wait till the willows go to sleep, which is what they say, the basket makers say. They wait till the willow goes to sleep, and that means the leaves fall off in the fall and it's getting ready for winter. And then you harvest these branches. And in traditional Shoshone basket making, a branch like this would be cut off and split into 3 parts. So you get 3 strips off of this one branch after the bark's taken off. And that allows you to clean the pith out of the middle, which is the part that'll rot and is soft. And that's the basis of their basket making for willow. One of the confusing names you have to deal with is a lot of tribes talk about red willow, and it's not really a willow. Yellow willow is a true willow, and there are something like 18 species of willow in this area. Yellow willow is the one preferred by the Shoshones to make tea out of for medicine as an analgesic. But when they speak of red willow, it's used to make tools. The bark is also used, the red willow bark is used as a mouthwash for bleeding gums. And it's different. It's not a salicylate. And I have one here. We can compare, because red willow actually grows in the same places that willows grow, along river bottoms, along streams, wet places. And that's where red willow grows, but you can see a major difference here. The branches come out alternately and kind of randomly off of one side or the other. But red willow, the branching is all opposite. These branches come out opposite each other on the stem. There's a branch here and a branch here. There's a branch here. It used to be one here, but it broke off. So all of the branching on red willow is opposite and revolute. Revolute means the branching comes out this way in a two-dimensional plane, and then you have to turn it 90 degrees to see the two-dimensional plane where these two branches come out next to it. And then you go down to the next node where there's opposite branching, and you have to turn the stem 90 degrees again. This allows the plant leaves to get more sunlight. But this bark is also medicinal. It's an astringent and it's analgesic, but not due to salicylates. So if you're allergic to aspirin, you could use this as an anti-inflammatory tea that can be taken internally. And it's used the same way. It's the inner bark that you want. You peel off the outer bark and save the inner bark. You can see the inner barks there. This is an older stem, so it's not flexible anymore. But this is the part you make tea out of. It's a really nice taste. I like it as an unusual, one-of-a-kind taste that's, I don't know, intriguing, I guess is a word I would use. Doesn't taste like anything else. So I use this tea to strengthen my gums after I've had a tooth removed or had my dentist work on my teeth. It tightens up the gums, and if you have any bleeding, it'll stop the bleeding in your mouth. So it's used for thrush and things where you have mouth sores, allergic reactions that cause your mouth to break out or get sensitive. And this is dogwood. So red willow is actually a dogwood. So this willow, the true willows, are in the genus Salix, in the family Salicaceae, which is the cottonwoods, poplars, aspens, and willows, which all have salicylic acid in them. They all are used like aspirin. This is a dogwood, which is not in the Salicaceae family. And it is red osier dogwood. Red osier dogwood. In the old journals of the trappers, it's called osier, or red osier. But the Indians called it red willow. So slightly different. But this was the traditional wood that was used for making handles on sacred items like rattles and ceremonial dance items as a stick. It's a much harder wood than willow, and it lasts longer. That's about all I want to say about dogwood. I guess I could say that it's antimicrobial. These branches and the inner bark are antimicrobial. And that's how dogwood got its name, is when dogs got mangy and they got ectoparasites like fleas and lice in England, where dogwood grows, they would fire up a big basin of water and throw in a bunch of these sticks from dogwood, and then they would drench the dog. They would dump the dog inside that water and submerge it and pull it out, and it would kill all the ectoparasites. So that's how dogwood actually got its name, as a treatment for parasites in dogs, ectoparasites. So willow is also used to make shelters, temporary shelters, and sometimes sweat lodges. And here you can see Melanie Smokey and her friend Alan, who accompanies her. She's a Western Shoshone basket maker. And all those baskets are made out of willow that have been cut into 3 strips along each branch. So get up high in the mountains, sedges become more common. They do well in cold water that fans out over wide valleys, and they can become the dominant vegetation in these valleys in the mountains. And they become bigger in these mountains, lakes and streams. They're good wildlife food for certain things like moose. But the part underwater on the Carex aquatilis, which is the water sedge, is very succulent and makes good food. It's a carbohydrate. As the plant grows above the water line, it gets more fibrous and you can't eat it. But below the water line, sedges are white and they are tender. You can eat them raw or you can boil them up like macaroni. And those are the stems, not the roots. Some of those stems can be 16 inches long under the water where they're white. And they taste good. If you chew on them for a while, it converts the starches into sugars in your mouth, and they'll have a little sweet taste. We don't do that anymore without boiling them first, because most of our water is contaminated these days with parasites. So there's the water parasites that are from animal feces, that are bacterial mostly, and then there's the Giardia, which is in most of the mountain streams now. And you don't want to get that. That's a nasty intestinal bug, which is treated by fringed sage, but you have to know you've got it first, and it's a horrible illness to have until you can treat it. So we don't eat the sedges raw anymore. We cook them, and then they come out like little macaroni. You can slice it up into chunks about 1 inch long, these stems, and it'll be a lot like macaroni after it's been boiled for a half hour or so. The roots are rhizomes that spread out under the mud in the lake or stream, and they can go for several yards. And if you pull those up, they can be cleaned off, take the bark off, which slips off very easily, and then cleaned, sliced, and either fried or boiled as a macaroni type, pasta type boiled dish. You would always add something with it for more flavor. Cattails are one of the things you can often find in the same place and add to the sedge roots, but it's a good carbohydrate source that is completely digestible. And in the old days, Eastern Shoshone don't make baskets anymore, but it was thought, as they came up to Wyoming and got the horse, they quit making baskets because they used buffalo parts more for cooking and water containers. But this is a sedge basket made entirely of sedges. And in this case, the sedges were woven green and then put out in the sun, and they shrink. The whole basket shrinks, and when it does that, it becomes watertight. So this is a watertight basket you can cook in. You can see how widespread sedges can occur, and just beaver move in first, create a pond, and as the pond silts in, it gets filled with mud, and sedges cover it, and eventually it becomes a meadow, a sedge meadow. This is a picture of the flowering parts of the um, Carex aquatilis, the water sedge, which is the biggest sedge we have. Sedges in the Ordovician period got to be 50, 60 feet tall. And now these are about 4 feet tall. Here you could see, that's actually me holding up some sedge stems in a nice collecting area where the white part that you cut up into macaroni type pasta dish is a good foot long. There you can see the rhizomes, which are a little more dense carbohydrate. But those are all cut up and cleaned and cooked, all the white parts. And here is this basket. I actually traded for this in Ethiopia. I think these people didn't know about money, so it was like 2 or 3 empty bean cans and some razor blades for this basket. But it's made from an Ethiopian sedge that is just like our sedge here. So it's a worldwide culture, basket making culture, using the same materials. And here's some sedges being cleaned and cooked. That's another sedge there. But along these same waterways we can find cattails. I've got one here from last year, so it's kind of brown and dried out now, but you can see the head on it is pretty much the way it looked. When these are green, they're just starting to flower. They'll turn a little bit purplish. You can eat them like corn on the cob, like that. Just in the early flowering stage. When these heads, it's called a seed head, but when before it goes to seed, it'll be pollinating from these flowers, and it'll produce a yellow pollen that you can turn over and shake into a basket, or shake it into a bag, and collect that yellow pollen, which is about 98 to 99% digestible protein. It's the richest protein source known, and put that into flour like our biscuit root flour, made from these biscuit roots, and add the pollen to it, which was a common practice in the spring of the year. Shoshones did that, and other tribes did it to add a little flavor, a little color, because it's a yellow color, and nutrition, a lot of nutrition. So bread made with cattail pollen is a high protein bread. The stems down below the water line can be 1 foot to 2 feet long, where they're white and under the water, and those are delicious, sliced up and fried with wild onions, or the Monarda bee balm, spiced up a little bit to add more flavor, and they can be fried in butter or buffalo fat or marrow. That's the best thing, elk marrow. To fry sliced cattail stems is a delicious thing. That is fun to eat because they're kind of, they got the crunchiness of, the crispness of water chestnuts. And water chestnuts are a Chinese sedge. So there's a lot of functions as far as building materials that cattails are used for. For one thing, these leaves, these long green leaves, when they're still pliable and green, can be woven into mats, and they commonly were, to sit on in the teepee, or if you're working outside on wet ground and you want to sit on dry ground, you can make mats out of these leaves by just weaving them together and putting several mats on top of each other so you can sit and work with your plants. If you're pounding plants or breaking up pine nuts on a mono and metate, you're usually outside on the ground. And cattail mats are very common for sitting. When the cattail fluff comes out, when these go to seed and the seed head starts to disintegrate in the wind, this happens. This is a cattail seed head. I don't want to get it all over the place, but you can see what's starting to happen here. It's going into a fluff that's sometimes called kapok. Kapok was actually another plant, but this one was used also in World War II to make life vests for the Navy because they're such prolific producers of this fluff that are the seeds, the airborne seeds of cattail. I'm going to gently put this back in so we don't fill the entire room up with this stuff because it is very airborne. And here's a bag of the fluff. Very soft. It creates an airspace. So clothing was actually insulated. Pillows were made out of this. Diapers were made out of this as the padding material between buckskin. And where we had, I thought I had a picture of it here, but travois carried children behind horses. Before that, travois were attached to dogs that carried children on the travois. And mats were made out of buckskin and cattail fluff. This is a kind of a demonstration model. The actual pad would have been larger than this that the baby would be on, or a young child while he's bouncing around on a travois pulled behind a horse on a long migration. So padding and insulation for winter clothing were all made out of the fluff of cattail seeds. And this is what it looks like. It's really good material and it's easy to get, very common. It's not the only thing that was used as an insulation. We talked about milkweed earlier. This is milkweed fluff with the seeds attached. These were also made into pillows and insulation for winter clothing, usually vests, but sometimes leggings were stuffed with 2 layers of legging leather with milkweed or cattail in between as the insulating layer that created the airspace for super cold weather. And one other form of padding was fireweed, which makes a similar type of fluff, or kapok. And fireweed also produces a lot of this so that its seeds can be airborne. So just to show you without getting too exuberant, because we don't want this to fly all over the place. But this is the fluff of fireweed here. That's very similar to cattail and makes a good insulating material. So those were 3 common insulating materials to make vests, pillows, and pads. We're going to go to the wild chives. This is an allium. Onions are in the allium genus, related to willows. Related to lilies. But this is a very common mountain type of onion flavor that was used as a spice. the whole plant has that flavor. Usually it wasn't necessary to dig up the roots because the top part of the plant has a very strong onion flavor, and it's great for flavoring soups and meat. So the leaves were used, and after the flowers appeared, the flowers were used as the spice. The best part, the sweetest, if you want a sweet onion taste, then the buds before they open up are the best. The flower buds. You can eat those raw because they're a milder onion flavor. And that's the flower bud of the wild chive. This is a nice succulent chive leaf that can be chopped up and put into soups for flavoring. And here's a field of wild chives to show how abundant they are in a stabilized beaver pond, or what you would call a wet meadow, but it had been a beaver pond that stabilized, eventually filled in and replaced by sedges, and eventually these more stable plants like chives. There's somebody eating a chive leaf. So if you look carefully at these trees, there aren't any needles on these pines. They're all covered by lichens, which have killed those trees. They eventually will kill the trees. And that lichen is black tree lichen, Bryoria. Well, I forgot the species name, but Bryoria is the genus, and that's good enough, probably, for most people. Black tree lichen is what it's called, and it's an edible lichen. Some of the lichens are very poisonous, especially the crustose lichens that grow on rocks. They will absorb heavy metals, and they also produce some organic acids that are toxic to people. But this lichen can be steamed. It takes about 12 to 20 hours to steam them underground with hot rocks in a trench. But they're so prolific that you can have a great ceremony or a great gathering of people and build trenches that are 30 feet long and fill them full of hot rocks and feed hundreds of people. And this makes a dessert that's kind of like Jello. Not sure what it is. Oh, here it is. Here's some black tree lichen. It was originally on this stick, but we'll take it off here. Black tree lichen. It's kind of like insulation. It was like the old rock wool they used to put in ceilings and roofs as insulation. This can hang down from trees in long strands that are 3 or 4 feet long. They are filled with carbohydrates, but in this state here, they're just not edible because they're not palatable. But if you steam them for 12 hours or more underground with hot rocks and leaves of skunk cabbage or other plants that have big leaves with a lot of moisture in them, the steam will soften this up and eventually turn it into a jelly. That looks exactly like Jello. You could take it out, scoop it out, put it in a pot, and wiggle it, and it shakes just like Jello. And what they would do is put service berries into this while it was steaming, and it would flavor the Jello when it was done. I call it Jello, but it's a gelatin dessert that was flavored with sweet berries. And the sweetest berry is service berry, sometimes called June berry or Saskatoon berry. They're all different names for the same thing. Very common berry that grows in the mountains. And it'll flavor this And I have made it in, you can make it in a steaming pot, a steamer, and just put it up in the upper part of the steamer the way you'd steam broccoli, only you keep it on the wood stove for about a day or a day and a half. And it turns into black jello. And then you can put berries in it to flavor it up. And it's really quite nice. Except that it's black jello, and some people are not used to jello being black, so it's a little odd that way. In the Salish country in Montana, where this grows more commonly because it's a wetter habitat, you find a lot of flying squirrels because there's an enzyme in this lichen that flying squirrels require in order to eat pine nuts and digest them. So the distribution of this lichen determines the distribution of the northern flying squirrel. And there's 2 places in the Wind River Range where flying squirrels occur, and it's only because this lichen happens to grow in the trees there. One of them's right here at South Pass, and then on the west side of the Wind Rivers also, around Pinedale. In the Salish tradition, they believe in what they call Sasquatch, which is a wild man that lives in the forest there in Canada and northern Idaho. And in their traditions, they like to avoid people by hiding from them. And they festoon themselves with this lichen and stand amongst these trees that are covered with lichen. And according to their stories, that's how they can be amongst people and not be seen. There's a tree that's completely covered in black tree lichen. There's some more of it. This is another lichen that has spiritual uses. It's deadly poisonous. It's called wolf lichen, and it's called that because when people wanted to kill wolves, they would take some meat and chop it up and leave it out as a lure to bring in the wolves. And they would chop it up and put a big chunk of this lichen in the middle of it. And it kills a wolf in less than a day. But the Indians used it in a different way, and it's a widespread custom, actually, amongst many tribes, to have a piece of this lichen on your body somewhere when you're going out amongst strangers. And it's kept on your body to protect you from the ill intentions of somebody who may not like you, or somebody who wants to steal from you. So it's a spiritual protection, and often you'll find people who still use this, and you'll see them take their hat off, and there'll be a wad of this attached to the inside of the hat brim, or the sweat ring in the hat. It's colorful. It's used in miniature railroad sets as bushes and trees. And it looks a lot like this other lichen, which is gray colored here. It's sometimes called old man's beard. You could see the difference. It's important not to mix up these two. This little lichen is medicinal and can be taken internally, and it's called usnea. And this is the wolf lichen, which will kill you pretty dead if you eat it. So you want to make sure you get the usnea if you're trying to use it as an antibiotic, because that's what it is. It kills almost every bacteria, and that's the way it's used. And it's often used, it's not used as a first line of defense. Here it is in a more pure form. This is usnea lichen. It was gathered and dried and then rehydrated and actually eaten when people had internal infections that wouldn't go away with any other treatment. So it's a very strong antimicrobial lichen. Let's see what else we have. This is Valerian. I don't know, it's hard to see, but it's the plant in the foreground, which is in its own family, but it's related to the carrot family. And it's used as a sedative. So this has a nervine effect. It affects the nerves to relax them, and it's used for people who can't sleep or who are anxious about something to calm them down. So you could buy valerian in a drug form or in a capsule form, but it's a Native American medicine that was used as a root, saved as a dried root. You don't want to use it fresh because it contains isovaleric acid, and when it's fresh, it's an overpowering smell that is called the dirty sock factor. So you need to dry it out before you use it. It minimizes that odor. So we have here a plant that I always collect. It was used by the tribes as a standard medicine you often had in your medicine pouch for emergencies. I collect it, put it in my shirt pocket whenever I go hiking, clean off the outer bark, it's brown, and get down to the white core. Because once that dries, or even when it's fresh, if you have a bleeding wound that won't stop bleeding, you could shove this root into it or shave it down and put the shavings into the wound, and it'll close up the wound and stop it from bleeding almost instantly. And it's called Alumroot, Huchera parviflora. Grows in rocky places, usually right along the edge of a rock. Roots like to grow that way on hillsides. And I have used it many times in the mountains. Since I spent about 40 years working in the mountains, I'd run into people who were badly cut, badly injured with bleeding wounds, and this plant is so common that you can find it everywhere you go on hillsides. But I'd always have some in my shirt pocket just for emergencies like that. One time I treated someone who ran an axe through the top of his foot, and the blood was just spurting out because he had hit an artery. And there was some of this alum root growing nearby, and I just plucked it out of the ground, shaved off the bark, took that root and carved it with a sharp knife to form gill slits. And you do that on both sides of the root, and it looks like the gill slits in a fish. But that it just exposes more surface area, and you could put that right into a long gash like that axe wound and press it in there, tie it up with a bandana, and it'll just close it up and close the capillaries and the arteries that are bleeding and just shut them down. It's very effective. It's the best styptic medicine we have in the mountains. This is a mountain plant that's fairly common in some places, called Harebell, and it's sometimes called bluebells. These are the bluebells of Scotland that you've heard about, because in Scotland they call them bluebells. But we have another plant that we call bluebells here, so this became harebells, and they have a sweet tasting flower. They shouldn't really be eaten if you only find a few plants, because sometimes they're scarce. But if you find a whole field of these flowers, they're quite sweet for a flower, and they taste good and abundant. This is a thistle, and this is one of the native thistles. We think of thistles as being exotic plants that came from Europe or Asia, but we have at least 2 species in this area that are native. This is the best tasting one. Thistles are actually good food and tasty. This one is called Elk Thistle, Cirsium foliosum. The stems are edible, the leaves are edible, and the roots are edible. In this case, at this stage in development, the flowers are just starting to come out. They attract a lot of pollinating insects, so you need to be careful when you're handling this plant for 2 reasons. One is it often has bees, solitary bees, soil nesting bees, and bumblebees. And it also has some very sharp spines on it that are not good to get poked into your hands because they're very sharp. So when you come close to this plant, you can take a long bladed knife. A machete works great, or a knife with a good length of blade on it. And this one will actually do if you hold it right at the end, a knife about this long. And just start peeling away the leaves from the top down. And you can do a whole side of the plant with one stroke and get all the leaves to come down. And then the central stalk is a hollow-stemmed, very succulent green stalk. And once you get all of those sharp, spiny leaves off of it, you can chop that off at ground level and then chop off the top where the flowers are and cut it in half lengthwise, and you have what looks like 2 celery stalks with about the same consistency as celery, and with a nice kind of lemon, not lemon, but watermelon type flavor. Kind of like the part of the watermelon that turns from red to green. Very succulent, and it's again a plant that's used as a rubbing stick. It's a toothbrush. Because when you cut the stem, it's stiff enough to be able to hold on to, it's rigid, and when you cut it, these fibers start to poke out like a brush, and you could use that, and it turns your saliva green, which disinfects your mouth, and it's a perfect rubbing stick. And then when you're done, you can eat it. So these can be cooked or eaten raw. When they're older, it's better to cook them. The leaves can be eaten too, but the outer margin of those leaves have very, very sharp stickers on them. And the way you get around that is you could take a flat board, piece of wood, and you lay the leaf out on it and just take a sharp knife and go down both edges of the leaf, and you can cut off all of the spines, and you have a delicious salad green with the crispness of radicchio, or the like cabbage, pretty stiff cabbage leaf, kind of like leaf lettuce too. Nice flavor, makes for good salads, and you can cook them too. The other species we have is called wavy leaf thistle. It looks exactly like this, only the leaf margins are more wavy and the stickers are more sharp. So it's a harder one to work with, but you could eat it in the same way. And then that one, the root, is sweet in the fall of the year after the plant has gone to flower and it freezes in late September. And in the mountains, that could be early September. You can dig up the root and chop it up and eat it just the way it is, like a carrot, at that time of year. In the midsummer, you can't do that. It won't even cut with a knife. It's woody. But by fall, it softens up and becomes a succulent carrot type of root with a sweet flavor. So this plant has more vitamin C than an orange by weight, and lots of B vitamins. So it's a good thing to eat and throw into a stew pot. And these thistles are a favorite of grizzly bears. It's probably some of the foods they eat that keep their teeth clean. Keeps them from having tooth decay. The loosely bound chlorophyll in thistles and cow parsnip and some of the other plants that bears really go after as mostly herbivores keep their teeth from getting bacterial buildup. So we could use it the same way. So here we finally get up to tree line. We're now in the subalpine zone.